Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to NSMA's 37th Annual Conference, Day 2, our final day. And we're pleased as punch to kick off with State of the Spectrum. We have Evelyn Remaley and Sean Conway. I'm going to introduce Evelyn. And hello there, Sean. We see you out there in the hinterlands. And I think you're both on mute. So if you unmute your microphones as needed, you'll be able to speak. And first and foremost, I just want to introduce Evelyn and Sean. So Evelyn has served as acting Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Communications and Information and acting NTIA Administrator in 2021 and 2022. Prior to her work with the federal government, Ms. Remaley led a cybersecurity and internet policy team at Booz Allen Hamilton in McLean, Virginia. Here, she oversaw efforts and provided subject matter expertise, supporting a wide range of cyber policy and governance projects for the Department of Defense and Homeland Security. Prior to her time at Booz Allen, Ms. Remaley worked for a leading internet service provider in its internet privacy and security federal practice, and spent time deploying the internet across communities through her work with public libraries. Ms. Remaley holds a Bachelor's of Science degree with Carnegie Mellon University and a Juris Doctor from Catholic University of America, Columbus School of Law. Go Cardinals. And also want to introduce Sean as well in his bio. Sean Conway regularly assists clients of all sizes with a broad array of communications and emerging technology issues before the Federal Communications Commission, the U.S. Department of Transportation, and other government agencies, with a very specific focus on wireless and broadband subsidy and transportation issues. He also works with leading companies in gaining transaction approval from the FCC. Prior to joining the firm in March of 2017, Sean served at the FCC as the Deputy Director of the Office of Legislative Affairs, where he advised then Chairman Wheeler on interactions with Congress. This capped a 2.5-year period during which Sean also served as legal advisor to the Chief of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau and as an attorney advisor in the Wireline Competition Bureau. In the Wireline Competition Bureau, Sean was a part of a team that modernized the E-rate program, the government's largest educational technology program. Sean began his legal career in the policy and regulatory section of a large international law firm. And also, before we jump in, I also want to give a shout out to Bryan Tramont, who pulled all this together. So there you go, Bryan, if you're listening now or later. And I'll just hand it over to Evelyn and Sean on 2022 Spectrum developments. Thanks so much. And we usually have a Q&A in the back end. And of course, if something urgent pops up in the middle that you want us to chitty chat about, we're happy to do that as well. And there we go. Thank you.
Joe, thank you so much for the introduction. Really appreciate it. It is so good to be here with all of you this morning. Just really want to thank the organizers at the National Spectrum Management Association for inviting us to present today. This is, of course, always one of the best, most insightful conferences on spectrum policy. We're glad to be here on the second day with such a jam-packed agenda and good presenters. As Joe mentioned, I'm here with Sean Conway today, who is one of our resident experts at WBK on spectrum. Glad to be sharing the presentation with him today. As Joe mentioned, we're going to cover 2022 spectrum developments. As we all know, spectrum has always been a critical interest to our economy and national security, but we know too that it's growing in importance, and it is a scarce, a finite resource, and so we see a lot of interest, a lot of competition about how we're going to use the spectrum as we continue to grow our economy and continue to keep our country safe and to be able to perform all the essential missions that we do in the US too. So it's an exciting time to be involved in spectrum policy. So we're going to touch on where we are, but just to give you a sense of the magnitude in terms of how things are growing, changing. Mobile network data traffic grew over 40% between 2020 and 2021. And it actually now accounts for almost 55% of traffic. And so as you know, as we continue to move into more of a 5G and Internet of Things environment, our demand for spectrum continues to grow. And so within the federal government and across industry and all the key players, lots of discussions underway in terms of how we can really craft a spectrum policy future that meets the current demands of the environment. So just with that little intro, why don't we jump in and get going in terms of the state of play. So Sean, why don't we move on to the next slide?
And actually, Mariana is going to run the slideshow for us, Evelyn.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks, Mariana. So as she brings up the slides, I'll just give a little bit of overview of what we're going to cover today. We'll first go through the key players who are helping us to craft that spectrum legal and policy environment for the future. Then we'll get into some of the nitty gritty about the auctions and policy issues that are keeping us all very busy and active, and then talk a bit about where things are headed from here. So with that, why don't we move to slide 3, and I'll pass it over to Sean to bring us up to speed on where things are with the FCC and their major players.
Thanks, Evelyn, and thanks, Joe and Mariana, for inviting us to speak today. Always, as Evelyn said, always really impressive lineup of presenters and a jam-packed, insightful agenda of issues that you guys cover each year. So really happy to be part of it in 2022. So I'm going to just give a brief overview of the current state of play at the FCC. Obviously, the FCC is extremely important. They administer use of spectrum by non-federal users. The commission's comprised of 5 commissioners, no more than 3 of whom can be from the same party, and the president designates one of the commissioners to serve as the chairperson. We currently have 4 commissioners at the FCC right now. Chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel has served on the commission since 2012. President Biden designated Chairwoman Rosenworcel to serve in an acting capacity back in January of 2021. And in October of 2022, he announced his intention to remove her acting title, and she is now the permanent chair of the commission. Also last year, she was confirmed for another term to serve at the commission. So that term doesn't expire until June of 2025. She's joined on the commission by Jeffrey Starks. Commissioner Starks was nominated in 2018, and confirmed in 2019. His term expires in June of 2022, so next month. But under the FCC's rules, he is effectively permitted to serve as a commissioner through the end of the next calendar year. So that would mean that he's effectively allowed to serve through the end of 2023, assuming he's not confirmed for another term. Commissioner Brendan Carr is the senior Republican commissioner at the FCC. He was nominated and confirmed to the commission back in 2017. Before that, he held a number of very senior roles at the FCC. He served as general counsel under Chairman Pai, and before that was Commissioner Pai's legal advisor on wireless issues. So very substantive on wireless issues. He's joined by Commissioner Nathan Symington, who is the newest member of the FCC. Commissioner Symington was nominated and confirmed back in 2020. He is the only FCC commissioner to have never worked at the FCC as a staff person. However, he did work at NTIA as a staffer with Evelyn, in fact, and she's going to speak to the NTIA leadership in a moment here. And the fifth commissioner spot is currently vacant. President Biden did nominate Gigi Sohn to serve as that commissioner back in I think October or November of last year. The Senate Commerce Committee voted on Sohn's nomination back in March, and that resulted in a split vote along party lines, 14-14. The nomination is reported to the Senate floor, but is subject to a procedural discharge vote before the Senate can take on consideration of the underlying nomination. There's some speculation in terms of whether nominee Sohn will be approved by the Senate, but right now that's our sort of to be determined over the next few weeks and months. So with that, I might hand it off back to Evelyn to walk through the leadership at NTIA, and we can go to the next slide, Mariana.
Thanks, Sean. Yes, so talking about the NTIA leadership on Spectrum. So we have a new administrator at NTIA as of January of this year, Alan Davidson. Alan has a strong history at the Commerce Department, previously had been at NTIA as Director of Digital Economy there. So coming in with quite a bit of background in terms of how the agency works. He's joined in leadership by the Associate Administrator for the Office of Spectrum Management, Charles Cooper, and they together oversee NTIA's Spectrum mission. NTIA works very closely with all the interagency members on the executive branch side, as well as the FCC as a close partner. The way to understand the difference between their two missions is that the FCC is responsible for commercial spectrum, whereas the NTIA is the regulator of the federal use of spectrum. So moving on to slide 5. Thanks, Mariana. So talking about the other major federal players who play a role. So again, on the federal side, you have many agencies with equities, with interests in how spectrum policy in the US is managed. They have holdings in various bands. They have essential missions that depend on that spectrum. Some of the critical players, of course, Congress being playing a major role in terms of legislation and really being able to set spectrum policy based on their processes that NTIA and the FCC would then need to implement. The White House having a major role in setting direction, working very closely with NTIA on the federal side to set policy, and also taking that broader view of the digital economy and how spectrum and our spectrum policy and our approach to it complements that. Traditionally, we have had a strong role by OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, working with NTIA on spectrum policy. In the current environment, we have more engagement from the National Security Council and the National Economic Council on spectrum policy as OSTP continues its staff up of additional personnel who will look at spectrum issues. The Department of Transportation, we'll touch on them a little bit later in the presentation. Major equities and how spectrum is managed. The Department of Defense, of course, as well, and all the missions that they have both domestically and globally that depend on spectrum, and several other agencies. And just to give you a sense of how the organization works, there are several interagency committees that bring these players together. One is called the IRAC, the Interdepartment Radio Advisory Committee. They make policy through that body in terms of spectrum allocations. And then there is also a group, the PPSG, which is the Policy and Plan Steering Group, where this group comes together and they make policy recommendations for spectrum. The FCC is the liaison to the IRAC and also participates as a liaison in the PPSG as well. Let's move on to slide 6. Great. Okay, and so now we are going to give you an update on some of the recent spectrum developments. And with that, I will pass it back over to Sean.
Thanks, Evelyn. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about some of the actions that the FCC has taken on spectrum issues, really since the Biden administration began last January. And then we're going to pivot in the second part of this discussion to some of the upcoming spectrum developments that we can expect over the next calendar year. There's going to be two major themes that really jump out throughout this discussion. The first is efforts to spur more intensive use of spectrum. So, you know, it's widely acknowledged at this point that there is no more greenfield spectrum opportunities, at least in the lower and mid bands. All of that spectrum is being used right now. So there's a focus by policymakers on more intensively using some of that spectrum. And then we're going to talk about efforts to identify additional spectrum for 5G, which is critical to the nation's economy, as well as a number of other sort of national priorities, defense, transportation, et cetera. So why don't we go to the next slide, Mariana? I'm really going to focus here on 4 bands that have been the subject of FCC rulemakings over the last year, in which the FCC has been attempting to spur more intensive use of spectrum. Those bands are the 6 gigahertz band, the 5.9 gigahertz band, the 4.9 gigahertz band, and then the 60 gigahertz band. We're going to start with the 6 gigahertz spectrum. So for those of you who have attended this event in the past, you're probably very familiar with the 6 gigahertz band, but just to give you a little bit of history, back in 2017, the FCC really adopted a notice of inquiry, really exploring ways in which to open up the 6 gigahertz band for additional unlicensed opportunities. And at that point, the 6 gigahertz band was being used for fixed microwave operations by mobile wireless providers, utilities, and public safety users. It was being used by broadcasters for mobile broadcast auxiliary service, and it was being used by fixed satellite service. Following the 2017 notice of inquiry, the FCC adopted a notice of proposed rulemaking in 2018. And then that ultimately led to the adoption of a report and order in April of 2020. And that report and order opened 1,200 megahertz of unlicensed spectrum in the 5.925 to 7.125 gigahertz band. So 1,200 megahertz of spectrum is a really wide swath of spectrum, and the Commission, while opening that spectrum to unlicensed opportunities, also adopted safeguards to protect incumbent operators from harmful interference. The FCC's rules in April of 2020 allowed for standard power operations coordinated by an automated frequency coordinator, or AFC, in the 5925 to 6425 range, and as well the 6525 to 6875 range. The Commission's rules also allowed for low power indoor operations throughout the entire 1,200 megahertz. This action was largely applauded by unlicensed proponents. One of the key results of the action is that it opens up opportunities for the latest generations of Wi-Fi, which require 160 megahertz and 320 megahertz of channels. So there's numerous channels now that are available for these latest generations of Wi-Fi, and there's an expectation that there will be significant economic benefit resulting from that. Mariana, do you want to move to the next slide here? But there were really 3 outcomes of that FCC action in April of 2020, and we're going to focus on all 3 of those. The first is that there were challenges to the final rules. We saw challenges from the incumbents, as will be probably a sort of recurring theme for FCC spectrum policy in the future. There was also ongoing work to implement those final rules, and there will be ongoing work to examine potentially new rules that were teed up in an associated further notice of proposed rulemaking that was also adopted in April. So let's first focus on the challenges to the final rules. So the parties that were challenging these rules are largely the incumbents, wireless providers, broadcasters, public safety users, and electric utilities. And they really pursued two different types of challenges. First, certain parties filed petitions for review in the DC Circuit. So this is a sort of traditional judicial appeal. And then there were parties that filed petitions for reconsideration at the FCC, so an administrative appeal. And their basis for their challenges really focused on sort of three issues. One, they argued that the low power indoor operations that the FCC permitted throughout the 1200 megahertz in the band is going to cause harmful interference to fixed links and to broadcast auxiliary service operations. They disagreed with the FCC that the protections on whole were adequate to protect incumbents. And they disagreed with some of the modeling and studies that had been submitted into the record by Wi-Fi proponents, justifying the protections that the FCC ultimately adopted. Now, as the judicial appeal and the reconsideration proceeding proceeded, many stakeholders continued to submit studies to the FCC showing that 6 gigahertz low power indoor access points will cause harmful interference to the fixed incumbent wireless links. And then in response, you had unlicensed proponents filing their own studies sort of justifying the actions that the FCC took. Mariana, you want to go to the next slide? So the DC Circuit opinion was really a closely watched opinion in spectrum circles. Most observers considered that the type of deference that the DC Circuit ultimately provided to the FCC on issues like sharing and interference assessments will really be a harbinger of how courts treat FCC actions moving forward in terms of making more intensive use of the bands, of spectrum bands. And what we saw from the DC Circuit opinion is that the courts are going to provide the FCC fairly broad discretion in terms of the technical assessments they make on these spectrum issues and sharing issues. The DC Circuit largely denied the petitions for review in almost all respects, except for one that we're going to get to in a second here. The court agreed with the FCC that the order never claimed it was going to reduce the risk of harmful interference to zero, but rather that the goal of the order was to make the risk of harmful interference insignificant, but not impossible. So that's the new sort of standard or threshold that the DC Circuit at least is going to use when reviewing FCC orders on sharing and making more intensive use of spectrum. The court also concluded that the FCC's assertion that the Enforcement Bureau would investigate instances of harmful interference was part of the calculus that the FCC made and was a reasonable calculus. And the court also noted that if the Enforcement Bureau is not up to the task, that petitioners can return to the FCC itself. So they have a number of sort of avenues to pursue interference concerns should the protections that were adopted in April 2020 not be sufficient. And the court also provided significant deference to the FCC's technical arguments. So one of the major takeaways from the DC Circuit result here is that it's really going to raise the stakes on FCC rulemakings. So if courts are going to grant such significant deference to the agency on these types of issues, parties are really going to have to rely on their advocacy at the FCC to the extent they want to prevail, on these issues moving forward. Mariana, could you go to the next slide, please? So I'm going to jump into implementation now. So just as a reminder, the FCC's 6 gigahertz order, it authorized two different types of unlicensed operations, standard power and indoor low power operations. Standard power operations are standard power access points and fixed client devices, and they must operate under the control of an AFC system to prevent harmful interference to the fixed incumbents. The FCC kickstarted implementation of this aspect of the order in September 2021 when it released a public notice seeking applications to authorize AFC systems. Proposals were due November 30th of 2021. Despite that cycle ending, applicants are continuing to provide the FCC with additional information to supplement their initial proposals. And incumbent stakeholders continue to file ex parte letters expressing concerns with the proposals. And one concern that we see over and over again is that the parameters are not being uniformly implemented, which is going to lead to varying levels of protections for incumbents. Can you go to the next slide, Mariana? And then, of course, there's other issues that are teed up by the further notice that was adopted by the Commission back in April 2020. So that FNPRM proposes to permit very low power devices to operate both indoors and outdoors across the 6 gigahertz band. Right now, those very low power unlicensed devices are only permitted to operate in indoor environments. The FNPRM also sought comment on increasing the transmit power of indoor access points that operate without an AFC. And it seeks comment on whether standard power access points should be permitted in mobile applications. So the FNPRM really seeks to expand the universe of unlicensed operations that would be permitted in the 6 gigahertz band. In January of 2021, the FCC's Office of Engineering and Technology also released a public notice seeking comment on whether the FCC should permit direct communications between client devices. That record or that comment cycle has closed, but there are parties that continue to file ex parte filings in that docket. The timing of the 6 gigahertz second report and order on reconsideration is uncertain right now. There have been a number of filings by unlicensed proponents urging the Commission to move on a second report and order, but right now most of industry is in a wait and see mode as we see sort of when the FCC takes on that second report and order. So I'm going to move on now to the next slide, Mariana, if you might. And we're going to focus on the 5.9 gigahertz band. So those of you who have been in the spectrum area are most likely very familiar with the 5.9 gigahertz band. This has been a band that has been the subject of a lot of scrutiny over the last few decades. Just to give you a little bit of history on this band, back in 1999, the FCC allocated 75 megahertz in the 5850 to 5925 band for intelligent transportation systems that operate direct short-range communications. So communications between one car and another without going through the cellular networks, communications directly from a car to roadside infrastructure like stoplights, bridge warnings, and other types of roadside infrastructure. In 2003, the FCC adopted technical rules that required the use of a specific technology throughout that 75 megahertz. That technology was known as dedicated short-range communications, or DSRC for short. And since 2003, really sort of 3 things had occurred. One, DSRC was never deployed in vehicles to the extent that almost everyone envisioned back in 2003. The lower 45 megahertz of this band became increasingly valuable to unlicensed proponents in order for that spectrum to be paired with unlicensed spectrum immediately below the 5850 band. And there was all this innovation in the cellular industry. It went from 2G to 3G to 4G to 5G now. And along the way, the cellular industry figured out a way to allow cars to speak directly to cars using cellular protocols rather than DSRC. And that new technology is referred to as C-V2X, cellular vehicle to everything. So in November 2020, the FCC adopted a report and order that adopted a new band plan to encourage more intensive use of the 5.9 gigahertz spectrum. Under that new band plan, which is illustrated here on the screen, the lower 45 megahertz is allocated right now for indoor unlicensed operations, but the upper 30 megahertz remains for ITS use and specifically for C-V2X use. That action was taken right after the election, I think a week or two after the November 2020 election. And it also has resulted in sort of a number of avenues of advocacy following it. So first, state transportation and amateur interests who were also authorized to use this band on a secondary basis. They sought court review of the reallocation of the lower 45 megahertz to indoor unlicensed use. Oral arguments were held in that DC Circuit litigation back in January of this year. A decision is expected sometime late spring or this summer. Most observers believe that the FCC order is going to be upheld. There were also petitions for reconsideration filed at the FCC, administrative appeals effectively. In those petitions for reconsideration, those largely auto interests sought reconsideration from the FCC on the out-of-band emissions limits that the commission adopted for indoor unlicensed use in that lower 45 megahertz. Most of those petitions for reconsideration focused on the fact that the report and order the FCC adopted granted actually greater flexibility on out-of-band emissions limits than even the Wi-Fi industry had requested in the record. There also have been a number of waiver requests filed at the FCC. A number of automakers and state DOTs have requested permission to deploy C-V2X now under waiver authority. The report and order that the FCC adopted in November 2020 did not actually implement rules for C-V2X, but teed up in a further notice questions about what type of technical and operational parameters should be permitted for C-V2X operations in the upper 30. So these entities have sought waiver authority to start deploying their C-V2X systems now. And we're waiting on FCC public comment on those waiver requests. There's also an FNPRM associated with the report and order, as I had indicated, that tees up a host of issues, including final rules for C-V2X, additional spectrum for 5G-based C-V2X. There are auto proponents out there who suggest that 30 megahertz is not sufficient for C-V2X as it evolves to 5G. Excuse me. And then that FNPRM also tees up issues relating to expanded unlicensed operations to outdoor areas. Right now, as I mentioned, the FCC's rules only allow for indoor unlicensed use. So more to come on the 5.9 band. If not this year, then most likely next year. Mariana, can you go to the next slide, please? And close to the 5.9 band is the 4.9 gigahertz band. A little background on this band. This is 50 megahertz of spectrum designated for public safety use nearly 2 decades ago. By most accounts, the band's sort of underused outside of most major areas of 90,000 or so eligible public safety entities. Only about less than 2,100 held licenses as of 2020. So in 2020, the FCC under Chairman Pai adopted rules allowing for non-public safety operations in this band through a state-by-state leasing framework. Last fall, the FCC adopted an order on reconsideration that resets the 4.9 band rules to those that were in effect prior to the 2020 order, and it vacates the leasing framework. That order on reconsideration was accompanied by an eighth, if you can believe it, an eighth further notice of proposed rulemaking. That eighth further notice of proposed rulemaking, asks a number of questions about ways in which the commission can foster sort of greater public safety use of the band, given sort of the widespread agreement that it is underutilized right now. And it tees up issues like frequency coordination, use of a nationwide band manager, how to promote the use of 5G by public safety entities. It also seeks comment on ways to facilitate non-public safety access that would be sort of compatible with a primary public safety use of this band. Chairwoman Rosenworcel referenced the 4.9 gigahertz band in remarks she made at Mobile World Congress earlier this year. And she in particular, as you can see from the quote on the screen here, referenced an interest to make use of this band for 5G services for public safety. So no indication yet in terms of when the FCC plans to act in this band. but the expectation is there will be some action, if not this year, then likely next year. Mariana, could you go to the next slide, please? And last but not least, as we talk about recent bans that have been subject of FCC rulemakings, is the 57 to 64 gigahertz notice of proposed rulemaking and series of waivers. Background on this ban: it's allocated for unlicensed device operations and radars. The current rules limit what's called as field disturbance sensors or radar devices to power levels that are below those of unlicensed devices and restrict many mobile operations of these radar devices. But through some recent technological advancements in radar devices, there's an increased demand for permission to operate those devices at higher powers. So in 2018, the FCC granted a waiver to Google to allow radar operations at higher powers. And in 2021, in early 2021, it granted a series of waivers to device manufacturers who wanted to develop mobile radars at higher powers than permitted in the rules, but only in specific situations, those situations being what's referred to colloquially as hot car sensors. These are sensors that are placed in vehicles that alert a driver who's getting out of the car that there's movement in the back seat to prevent some of those tragedies that we see in the news from young children or animals being left in the back of a hot car accidentally by drivers. Shortly after the FCC granted those waivers, it adopted a further notice of proposed rulemaking, proposing rules to allow unlicensed FDS operations at higher power limits and in mobile devices. The FCC sort of continues to take comment in that proceeding. The record reflects interest in using this band for things like autonomous vehicles, drones, as well as the sort of the hot car sensor radars that the FCC has already permitted through its waiver authority. So more to come in this band, most likely, but again, timing also here is to be determined. Mariana, can you go to the next slide, please? And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Evelyn to talk about some of the recent FCC auctions.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks so much for walking us through that very substantive overview of many things that are happening right now at the Commission. So yes, let me just touch on, and I know we're trying to save some time for some questions at the end, so I will walk through these pretty quickly. But yes, the C-band auction, which concluded in February 2021, raised an unprecedented $81 billion. Of course, I think an absolute signal to where things are headed and how important this mid-band spectrum can be for 5G services. So that was actually broken into two phases. The incumbents for that auction committed to an accelerated clearing in two phases. The first was to be cleared by December 5th. 2021, that's the 3.7 to 3.8 gigahertz, and then the second tranche being the 3.8 to 3.98 gigahertz by December 2023. Now, I know many of you are following the spectrum sector very closely. I'm sure that you all followed the very active conversations that then pursued with the Department of Transportation, the FAA, the FCC, NTIA, and the wireless industry, even in terms of that first tranche, due to some issues with altimeters in aircraft. And so there were some additional details that needed to be worked out that delayed that first deadline. But through some agreements, things are continuing to move forward. Deployments are underway in the band. And things are moving forward. I think this was a good example one thing that the new administration coming in has focused on is making sure that spectrum decisions are being informed by good science, good studies. I think coming out of this exercise, there is a renewed commitment to all of the players to be working very closely on how studies are being practiced and ensuring that as we move forward on auctions, that we are early to the gate in terms of getting all issues on the table. Why don't we move on to slide 16? Yes, and so again, a recent auction, the 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz that was auctioned just in the fall, raised 22 billion, and the land licenses were granted just this month earlier on May 4th. This was an auction that I think showed good legwork by all the players, got together quickly to work on, with the federal government, DoD in particular, NTIA, FCC industry, coming together to be able to make this auction a reality in the fall of 2021. Something that's interesting about this particular auction is the work that went into planning the cooperative planning areas and the periodic use areas for this particular slice of spectrum. So some good legwork there, setting us up for the next auction that is ahead as well. Let's move on to the next slide. And I think Sean is going to run us through these next two issues.
Great, thanks, Evelyn. And I'm going to move a little quickly because I do want to reserve some time for questions. So we identify here in this last part of the presentation some upcoming spectrum developments that the public can expect both from the FCC and from the federal government. That we're going to see most likely a focus on the same major themes, right? Efforts to spur more intensive use of spectrum and efforts to open up more spectrum for 5G. Mariana, could you go to the next slide? Thank you. So, with respect to making more intensive use of spectrum, one issue that the FCC has focused on from time to time is the fact that making more intensive use of spectrum necessitates policies that that not only focus on transmitters but also receivers as well. Back in 2003, the FCC initiated a proceeding looking at receiver issues. Back then, there was sort of broad consensus among the public and the record that the commission should not be regulating or acting on receiver issues. But things have changed over the last 20 years. We've seen sort of an increased focus now on from really sort of all parties on how do we take, use all of the tools in the tool bag to facilitate sort of more intensive use of spectrum. So earlier this year, the commission adopted a notice of inquiry on receiver performance. It was a fairly broad notice, seeks comment on sort of a whole host of ways the commission can promote more improvements in receivers. But I think the notable piece here is that it was adopted unanimously, even after the commission had this record from 20 years ago that largely was opposed to commission action in this area. And there's an expectation that there's going to be support for some type of federal effort to improve the performance of receivers. So comments in that proceeding are due June 27th, reply comments July 27th. Following the notice of inquiry, there will have to be a notice of proposed rulemaking to the extent that the commission decides that it wants to sort of move towards any type of sort of formal action or rules. So more to come here, but this is likely going to be something, given the sort of the broad support at the FCC, likely going to be an issue that's going to be a focus of Chairwoman Rosa Mersel's tenure moving forward. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Evelyn to take us through the remaining slides here.
Thanks, Sean. Yes, so what we have upcoming in terms of auctions, the 2.5 gigahertz is next, scheduled to commence that July 29th. And the plans for that are to make 8,000 new flexible use licenses available on a county-based area. For this particular auction, I think the winning bidders may operate in existing white spaces. That's been an area of much interest by the various players. Before I move on to the next slide, Sean, is there anything else that you would like to highlight about the 2.5?
No, other than there's sort of broad consensus right now that 2.5 gigahertz band is going to be one of the key bands for 5G. So after this auction occurs, I think you're likely to see a lot of discussion about how the band is utilized for 5G. And of most interest, the entity with most interest in this band is T-Mobile.
Great. Moving on to the next slide, Mariana, please. Thank you. Okay, so the FCC Auction Authority is actually set to expire on September 30th. So obviously lots of attention on this. They first obtained that authority in 1993, and Congress is currently evaluating options to extend the FCC's auction authority. Obviously, the industry would like to see the authority to come attached with a little bit more clarity around that spectrum pipeline, what's ahead. But this is one of the large issues that is continuing to be discussed as Congress looks at this. Sean, anything that you would like to add on the auction authority?
No, other than I think it's a question of sort of when and how the FCC acts, or the Congress acts, not if. They're obviously going to act here. The prevailing consensus is they will act before the auction authority expires. Just a question of sort of what avenue they take here and when they take it.
Okay, moving on to the next slide. Thanks, Mariana. So the spectrum pipeline. Chairwoman Rosenworcel has been outspoken, as well as the wireless industry also, signaling support for having a spectrum pipeline. So knowing where we're going, knowing what bands we're actually going to be looking at as we progress in terms of supporting 5G and these other advanced communication services that we've talked about, as well as other uses of the spectrum. The lower 3 gigahertz, that is one that's very supportive, opening up that mid-band spectrum for 5G, allowing that large contiguous band there, very important. So we're expecting additional work there. The IIJA actually requires DoD to conduct a study on the 3.1 to 3.45 to see what the holdings are there, what the any encumbrances, the difficulties, what could be done in terms of freeing up that spectrum. They'll be working very closely with NTIA and the other interagency partners as they begin that study. And then obviously the 8 gigahertz also of interest, both to wireless and unlicensed stakeholders as well. And then also the mid to upper frequencies in the 4 gigahertz band have also been identified as being areas that we should be looking at for the future as well. So lots of activity, and we'll just see how specific the federal agencies will be able to get in terms of the pipeline and where Congress will go on this as well. Let's move on to the next slide, please. And just continuing some of the other areas that we're headed in here. Let's move on to 23 since we're close on time. So the Spectrum Coordination Initiative, we wanted to just touch on this as well. I had mentioned during the C-band, getting ready for that deployment, how obviously some issues popped up in terms of the Department of Transportation, NTIA, the FCC, the industry members, both aviation and wireless, needing to work on issues there. The FCC and NTIA are very committed in the current environment to having very seamless collaboration, close collaboration on planning and spectrum policy. And so under Chairwoman Rosenworcel, as well as Assistant Secretary Davidson, they have launched a new spectrum coordination initiative. Under this initiative, they will be meeting monthly to talk through what the upcoming policy issues are and the planning issues for spectrum. Again, knowing how important the current environment is, and that the various federal players haven't always been on the same page, wanting to make sure that they're having good collaboration early and understanding any barriers and issues so that they can work on them early. Again, I'd also mentioned that this administration is committed to a science-based, very intensive technical engineering approach to how we free up spectrum. And I think you'll see a continued emphasis by this group and how the various government partners can ensure that they are working more closely together to understand any technical limitations, any technical barriers, and opportunities as they look to free up additional spectrum for commercial use while also protecting the essential missions of the United States. So this is a good development. And with that, let's move on to slide 24, just to say thank you for having us today, for allowing us to run through this content. And we may be at the end here and not have time for questions, but I'll pass it over to Joe, who I think will let us know.
Yeah, fair enough. I think we do one or two very quick questions. But before we even get into that, just wanted to, it's been a pleasure to have you guys. You guys are athletes of the megahertz world and gigahertz world, and we appreciate your being here. It's quite a pleasure. There's a question from Colin Alberts about, is there draft legislation prepared and introduced to extend auction authority in anticipation of the hearings this summer? And that might be a yes/no question. And a second question is, what do either of you think about a newer culture focused on empirically driven physical tests prior to resolving interference issues?
Sean, do you want to take the first one?
I will take the first one. Absolutely. Yeah. So, there is legislation that has been proposed to extend the FCC's auction authority. It's a really timely question, actually, because just yesterday, the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, Subcommittee on Communications, announced that it's going to be holding a legislative hearing next Tuesday. That's going to be looking at a number of bills. One of those is the Extending America's Spectrum Auction Leadership Act of 2022, which would extend the FCC's authority. Whether that bill ultimately becomes the bill that Congress adopts is sort of to be determined. Still in the early stages, there would have to be a markup and then reported at a committee. But nonetheless, there is activity on that front.
And I'll just quickly take the second part of the question. I think there's much interest in terms of, again, the FCC and NTIA, along with the other federal agencies, in terms of their collaboration on spectrum allocations and spectrum policy, to really dig deeper in terms of how studies, empirical evidence, that type of really bringing that engineering rigor and expertise into the decision making. They're definitely examining that. It's already an important part of the process, but seeing if they can set additional best practices, standards in the way that they integrate that type of examination as they're making decisions. The Secretary of Commerce, as many of you I'm sure have seen, has been outspoken in her desire for a national spectrum strategy, which the teams are committed to working together on, pulling together a whole of government approach to that. And so I think we'll see emphasis in that activity and the eventual strategy that's released on how we do empirical studies better in a more informative way to inform our policy in this area.
Always optimizing. Gotta love that. So, well, thank you both really very sincerely. And we're always pleased with Wilkinson coming along, and we're seeing some claps coming up virtually on the screen. So thank you so much for attending and your insights. And obviously feel free to jump into the conference at any point during the day. I know you're busy folks, but you're always welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joe. Thank you, Mariana.
Thank you all. Our next panel will be on spectrum management and human RF exposure. We'll be starting momentarily. Thank you.